They told her she was nothing, that she was lucky to be kept, lucky to be silent. For 8 years. She believed them, until the day her husband tried to erase her completely. What happened next shook the courtroom. Exposed a fraud, and revealed a secret so powerful it could no longer be buried. This is not just her story. It's the story of every voice that has ever been silenced. Before we begin, if you believe in truth, in justice, in stories that refuse to stay hidden, subscribe to Black Voices Justice. Because every week, we bring you the voices they tried to bury. Now, let's step into the courtroom. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy, pressing against the chest. Every shuffle of paper, every cough in the gallery seemed amplified in that stillness. At the front, Adrian Cole leaned back in his chair as if the proceedings were a performance staged for his amusement. With a practiced flourish, he took the pen handed to him and scrawled his name across the final page of the divorce decree. He signed not with the weight of ending a marriage, but with the speed of authorizing a lunch receipt. A smirk curved his lips as he slid the papers back across the polished oak table. Nyla Carter sat frozen across from him, her hands trembling in her lap. Her lawyer, Delilah Brooks, gave her a subtle nod, a reminder to breathe, to hold steady. But Nyla's eyes remained locked on the man she had once promised to love. She saw not just the end of their marriage in that ink, but the deliberate insult etched into every swooping letter of his name. Behind Adrian, in the second row of benches, Sloane Pierce crossed her legs and smiled. The crimson fabric of her dress caught the light like a deliberate warning flare. To anyone else, she was merely a colleague attending the hearing. But to Nyla, she was the woman who had been dining with her husband in restaurants she could no longer afford, vacationing in cities she only glimpsed on travel shows. Judge Evelyn Hart cleared her throat, her voice measured and stern. "Mr. Cole, you will remember that this court demands respect. This is not a stage for theatrics." Adrian didn't flinch. "Of course, Your Honor," he said smoothly, though his smirk remained. He had perfected the art of appearing compliant while radiating contempt. Nyla pressed her lips together, fighting the sting of tears. She thought of the years she had sacrificed, her job, her savings, even her voice, while Adrian built his career. He had told her once, "It's simpler this way. One of us earns, the other manages." But managing, in his vocabulary, meant living on an allowance he controlled, where every purchase was scrutinized, every receipt judged. Now, he sat there dismissing her worth with the casual swipe of a pen. Delilah whispered, "Steady, Nyla. Let him play his games." "We'll have our moment," Nyla nodded faintly. But inside, the humiliation pressed hard. It wasn't just about money or property or even betrayal. It was the way Adrian's signature seemed to say, "You were nothing." "You will always be nothing," the gallery whispered. A clerk shuffled papers. Judge Hart scanned the decree, her brow furrowing. Adrian leaned back, arms folded, speaking low enough for only Nyla and Delilah to hear. "You'll be fine, Nyla. Modest apartment, modest life. I hear freedom is priceless." The words were knives, dipped in casual charm. Nyla's hands curled into fists under the table. She remembered her father's words long ago when she was still a girl. "The world will try to tell you what you're worth. Don't let its voice drown out your own." At that moment, his voice felt impossibly far away. Sloane tilted her head, watching the tension unfold with a satisfied gleam. For her, this was victory. For Adrian, it was conquest. For Nyla, it was collapse, or the beginning of something neither of them anticipated. Judge Hart set the decree down firmly, her gavel hand resting against the desk. "This court will not tolerate disrespect," she said again, her eyes narrowing on Adrian. For a flicker of a moment, Nyla saw it. The first crack in his armor. If a single signature could erase 8 years of your life, would you bow your head? Or find the courage to fight back? Nyla sat very still, her back straight, her hands folded tightly in her lap, knuckles whitening under the pressure. Across from her, Adrian leaned back with his arms crossed, radiating triumph. His smirk hadn't faded, it had grown bolder. Every tilt of his head, every casual glance toward Sloane, was another deliberate wound, the clerk announced. This decree will now be entered into record. The words echoed like a closing door. 8 years. 8 years of marriage. Now sealed by a sentence spoken in monotone. Nyla wanted to scream, but she remained silent. She had learned the price of speaking too loudly. Adrian always made sure of that. Her lawyer, Delilah, leaned closer. Remember, this isn't over. Nyla gave a faint nod, but her chest was heavy. She had endured too much to believe in easy reassurances. Judge Hart tapped her pen against the desk. We will now address property allocation. That phrase alone made Adrian's lips twitch with amusement. He thrived in this arena. He had played this game for years, moving money, hiding assets, ensuring Nyla would walk away with nothing but scraps. Sloane shifted in her seat, legs crossing again, her red heel tapping against the floor. The sound was soft, but in Nyla's ears it was deafening. Tap, tap, tap like a countdown to humiliation. Delilah spoke firmly, presenting the proposed division. Your Honor, we contend that the current financial disclosures are incomplete. Several assets appear unreported. Adrian chuckled, an actual chuckle in open court. Incomplete? Ms. Brooks, my disclosures have been verified twice. There's nothing more to see. Judge Hart's eyes narrowed. Mr. Cole, I remind you this court expects full transparency. Yes, Your Honor, Adrian replied smoothly, though his grin betrayed his thoughts. Transparency was a word he had learned to manipulate. Nyla stared at the table, heat creeping up her neck. Her silence was not strength, it was survival. For years she had been told she was naive, that she didn't understand numbers. Every time she questioned, Adrian shut her down with a laugh, a sigh, or the chilling phrase, "Trust me," and she had. Now, the price of that trust sat before her in legal ink. Delilah pressed on. We have reason to believe Mr. Cole maintains offshore accounts. We will request time for forensic review. Sloane whispered something to Adrian, lips curling in a smile. Adrian nodded slightly, then leaned toward the microphone. With respect, Your Honor, this is harassment. There are no such accounts. I've provided everything required. The words slid out polished, rehearsed. He was the picture of corporate charm, but Nyla felt the dagger in them. Harassment. That's what he always called her. Questions. Harassment. Nagging. Overreacting. The courtroom blurred for a moment as her eyes watered. She blinked rapidly, refusing to let the tears fall. Not here. Not in front of him. Judge Hart studied Adrian for a long moment, then turned to Delilah. Counsel, if you can provide preliminary evidence, I will consider extending discovery. Delilah nodded. Understood, Your Honor. Adrian smirked again, as though he had already won. The silence pressed in heavier. Nyla's throat tightened. She felt as though her very existence was being erased in front of strangers. She remembered her father's words again. Soft. Steady, almost musical. Never let the world tell you you're invisible. Nyla, even shadows prove light exists. She gripped her seat. For the first time in the hearing, she looked up directly at Adrian. His smirk faltered, just slightly, under the weight of her gaze. He leaned closer, voice low. Don't forget, Nyla, you signed your life away the day you signed my name. Her stomach twisted, her breath shook, but she didn't look away. Silence may protect you for a season. But silence in court is exactly what predators count on. If you were in Nyla's place, would you stay quiet, or would you risk everything by speaking up? The night after court, Nyla sat alone in her apartment. The silence was sharp, almost cruel. She had left the courthouse with her head down, clutching papers that told her she was worth less than the man who betrayed her. She stared at the dim light above her kitchen sink. The bulb flickered now and then, like even it was too tired to shine. It had been Adrian's job to fix things, always Adrian. But now Adrian was gone. All that remained were bills she could barely read without trembling, and an emptiness that weighed more than any debt. 8 years earlier, she had walked into marriage with hope. She had walked away from her marketing career because Adrian said it made sense. One of us needs to focus on home, he had said. Trust me, Nyla. I'll handle the rest. At first it felt like partnership. Then it felt like permission. Eventually, it became control. He placed her on a monthly allowance. He demanded receipts. He reviewed her purchases as though she were an employee submitting expense reports. When she once bought a new dress for an anniversary dinner, he shook his head and muttered, "Impulsive again, huh?" The smile that followed was colder than the words. She stopped buying dresses, she stopped asking questions, and soon, she stopped speaking at all. The silence became her survival. Now, alone in this apartment with its flickering bulb, Nyla wondered how she had let her voice be erased so completely. Delilah had given her a packet of documents to review, financial disclosures, property lists, numbers upon numbers. Nyla flipped through them, each page filled with terms she barely understood. Discretionary account, transfer of funds, overseas entity. The words blurred, heavy with a language she was never allowed to learn. Her phone buzzed. A message from Delilah. "I'll come by tomorrow. We need to talk about what we saw in court." Nyla sighed. She wasn't sure she could handle more talk of numbers and lies. But she pressed the phone to her chest anyway, grateful that someone, anyone, still believed she was worth fighting for. She remembered the dinner last year when Adrian had introduced Sloane as his partner in strategy. Nyla had smiled politely, though her stomach had twisted. That night, she overheard them in the kitchen, their voices low, urgent. Words drifted through the air, offshore, shelter, accounts. When she asked Adrian about it later, he dismissed her. "You misheard. Stop making drama. It was always the same. Doubt yourself, question yourself, then fall silent." But the silence was breaking now, splintering under the weight of truth. Nyla opened a drawer in the small table by her couch. Inside, beneath old birthday cards and scraps of paper, she found her father's watch. The leather strap was cracked, the face scratched. He had worn it every day of his life. He had been a janitor, sweeping floors at buildings too grand for his paycheck. Or at least, that was the story she had always believed. She held the watch, pressing it into her palm until the metal edge left a mark. She whispered as though he were there, "Daddy, what would you do if someone tried to erase you?" The silence answered, but in her mind she could hear his laugh. Warm, steady, the kind that filled small rooms with comfort. And then his words, "Never let the world decide you don't matter." Even when your voice shakes, it's still your voice. Her eyes burned. She wanted to believe. She wanted to fight. But doubt gnawed at her. How does a woman who has been silenced for 8 years suddenly speak again? How does she prove what was stolen when the thief wears a suit and a smile? She clutched the watch tighter. For the first time in months, she spoke into the empty room. Her voice cracked, raw, but it carried. "He doesn't get the last word. Not this time." The bulb above her flickered again, and then held steady. Would you have stayed silent in that room? Or would you have dared to break the silence, even if your voice trembled? The next morning, Delilah arrived at Nyla's apartment with a stack of folders tucked under her arm. She moved with the confidence of someone who had seen too many battles and refused to lose another one. Nyla opened the door slowly, her face pale, her eyes swollen from a night of restless half-sleep. Delilah stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. She placed the folders on the kitchen table and studied the small, dim space. "You deserve better than this," she said softly, not with pity but with quiet outrage. Nyla managed a faint smile. "Better costs money." Delilah pulled out a chair. "Sit. We need to talk about yesterday." Nyla obeyed, lowering herself onto the chair, fingers fidgeting against the edge of the table. Delilah spread out the folders, pages filled with financial records, transaction histories, and screenshots of property deeds. "These aren't complete," Delilah explained. "Adrian is hiding assets. Offshore accounts. Properties not listed. It's textbook concealment." Nyla stared at the papers. They looked like another language. Symbols and numbers arranged in patterns she couldn't decode. "How do you know?" she whispered. "Because men like Adrian always think they're smarter than the system," Delilah said. "And because I've seen this before." He left trails, small ones. But enough, Nyla swallowed hard. "I should have known. I should have—" Delilah cut her off gently. "Stop, this isn't on you. He built a cage out of paperwork and charm. You trusted him. That's not weakness, Nyla. That's what trust is supposed to look like. The words settled heavy in the air. Nyla pressed her palms against the table, grounding herself. She thought of the years she had sat across from Adrian at dinner, nodding as he explained the world in numbers she wasn't allowed to understand. She thought of the way he sighed when she asked questions, the way he muttered, "You'd just get confused." She thought of the dress she never wore because he called it impulsive. She thought of the vacation she begged for, only to be told, "Maybe next year, if you're careful with spending." Careful. That was his favorite word. Delilah pushed a document forward. "Look at this." It was a transfer slip, a neat column of figures ending in a wire to a foreign bank. "This isn't in his disclosures," Delilah said. "And it's not the only one. He's been bleeding assets out of reach. But we're going to stop him." Nyla shook her head slowly. "He'll never let me win. He'll find a way." Delilah leaned closer, her voice steady but fierce. "He already thinks he's won. That's his mistake. What he doesn't realize is that silence is ending. You have a voice, Nyla. And soon, we'll make sure the court hears it." Nyla looked down at her father's watch, still wrapped around her wrist from the night before. The cracked leather, the scratched face. It didn't look like much, but it felt like armor. Delilah noticed and nodded toward it. "That belonged to him, didn't it?" Nyla nodded. "He wore it every day." "I thought it was just sentimental." Delilah studied her for a long moment. "Sometimes the things that look ordinary hold the most extraordinary truths." "Keep it close." Silence stretched between them. Not the suffocating silence of submission, but the kind that let words settle deep. Finally, Nyla spoke. "I overheard them once, Adrian and Sloane. They said something about offshore accounts." Delilah's eyes sharpened. "That's exactly what we needed. A lead, even if it's just a phrase. Combined with these transfers, it strengthens our case." Nyla exhaled shakily. "I never said anything. I just let it go. I was afraid." Delilah placed a hand on hers. "Fear kept you quiet then." "But courage doesn't erase fear, Nyla. It speaks anyway." "And that's exactly what you're going to do." The words cracked something open inside her. For the first time in years, she imagined herself standing in a courtroom, not as a shadow, but as a voice. A trembling voice, maybe, but a voice nonetheless. She squeezed the watch tighter and whispered, more to herself than anyone else, "He doesn't get to define me anymore." Delilah smiled faintly. "Good, because the real fight hasn't even started yet. If someone controlled every dollar in your life, would you accept the silence? Or would you finally demand to be heard?" That night, long after Delilah had gone, Nyla sat alone at her small kitchen table. The folders still lay open before her, papers scattered like fallen leaves. The apartment was silent, except for the hum of the old refrigerator and the steady ticking of her father's watch on her wrist. She reached for one of the boxes she had kept tucked away in the corner for years. It was dusty, the cardboard soft from time and neglect. Inside were the remnants of a life she hadn't been ready to face, her father's belongings, packed hastily after his funeral. She had never dared to open them fully. The grief had been too raw, and Adrian had told her, gently but firmly, better to leave the past alone, but tonight she couldn't ignore the pull. She needed answers. The first box held little more than photographs and old work uniforms, a janitor's badge, a faded cap, receipts for groceries, all the symbols of the life she had always known her father to have. Ordinary, modest, hardworking, she sifted through them slowly, her chest tightening with each memory that rose like smoke from the ashes. Then, at the bottom, she found something different. A leather-bound notebook, worn at the edges but intact. Her father's handwriting filled the pages in careful, deliberate strokes. Notes about meetings, numbers that looked too large to belong to a janitor's salary, names she didn't recognize. Her breath caught. She flipped further. More records, more signatures. References to businesses, contracts, and bank deposits. She stared at the words, her mind struggling to reconcile the father she remembered with the man revealed in these pages. Finally, she reached a page that froze her in place. Meeting with Harrison and Associates, Re. Nyla's future. The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. What had her father been planning? Why had he kept this hidden? Her fingers trembled as she turned another page, and there it was, a sealed envelope with her name written in his neat, familiar script. Nyla held it for a long moment, pressing it to her chest as if she could feel his arms again, strong and reassuring. Then, with a shaky breath, she broke the seal. The letter began simply, "My dearest Nyla, if you are reading this, it means I am gone, and you've finally been forced to look where you never wanted to look. I'm sorry for the pain this causes, but I hope what you find gives you strength instead of sorrow." She read on, each line pulling her deeper into a truth she never imagined. Her father had not been just a janitor. That was the surface, the mask he wore. Behind it, he had been a partner in businesses, an investor in properties, a man who built wealth quietly while living humbly. "I did it this way so you would learn what truly matters," the letter explained. "I didn't want money to define you. I wanted you to build your own strength before you ever knew of mine. But I also wanted you to be safe. If you're reading this now, it must mean you're facing a storm. Remember this, storms don't break strong trees, they reveal their roots. And you, my daughter, have roots deeper than you know." Nyla pressed the paper against her lips, tears streaming freely now. She had spent so long believing she was powerless, a dependent shadow in Adrian's world. And yet her father had left her not only wealth, but foresight, protection, and faith. The letter included instructions, contacts at Harrison and Associates, keys to a safe deposit box, names of business partners who owed her father loyalty. It was overwhelming, too vast to absorb all at once. But the words that lingered most were his closing lines. "Nyla, you were always my greatest investment. Not the money, not the properties, you. Never forget that you are worth more than anything Adrian could ever try to take from you." She set the letter down, her hands trembling but her heart steadier than it had been in months. The silence of the apartment shifted. It no longer felt like a cage. It felt like a sanctuary where the truth had finally been spoken aloud. She whispered into the quiet, "Daddy, I thought I was nothing. But you knew. You always knew." For the first time in years, she felt something ignite inside her, a fragile but undeniable flame. Not just hope. Not just anger. But a determination rooted in legacy. Would Adrian still smirk so easily if he knew the woman he tried to discard carried an empire in her blood? The next morning, Nyla woke before dawn. The letter from her father lay on the nightstand, its words echoing in her chest like a drumbeat. She had barely slept, her mind caught between grief, shock, and a strange new energy that felt almost dangerous. She dressed slowly, choosing her father's old watch instead of her wedding ring. The band was scratched and worn, but it felt heavier, more solid than the gold circle Adrian had slid on her finger years ago. When she caught her reflection in the bathroom mirror, she saw a woman she barely recognized. The tired, timid figure who had bowed her head in court yesterday was gone. In her place stood someone raw but unbroken. Someone who had been tested and was beginning to remember her own worth. She whispered to her reflection, "You are Robert Mitchell's daughter. Don't you ever forget that." Her day began like any other. Coffee, dishes, silence. But every movement carried new weight. She pulled the boxes back onto the table, this time sorting them with intent. Contracts, deeds, receipts, letters. She began cataloging them, page by page, as though she were piecing together a puzzle her father had left unfinished. By noon, she had enough evidence to prove that Adrian's empire was nothing compared to what her father had built in silence. Adrian had boats, cars, an office full of glass and chrome. But Robert Mitchell had left his daughter buildings, partnerships, investments, and a trail of legitimacy that Adrian could never match. Still, a heavy doubt crept into her mind. Would any of this matter? Could a black woman like her walk into a courtroom and be taken seriously against a man like Adrian, with his polished attorney, his practiced charm, his smug confidence? Her stomach nodded as she thought of the whispers that might follow. She's just bitter. She's exaggerating. She's trying to steal from a man who gave her everything. Nyla closed her eyes and gripped her father's letter. She heard his voice again. Storms don't break strong trees. They reveal their roots. She forced herself to stand. Her roots were deep, even if no one else could see them yet. That afternoon, she dialed the number her father had left for Harrison and Associates. The receptionist answered, her voice warm with familiarity the moment Nyla gave her name. "Miss Mitchell, we've been expecting your call." The words made her knees weak. Expecting her? How long had her father prepared this? Moments later, she was connected to a steady male voice. Judge Harrison, retired from the bench but still commanding authority. "Nyla, your father trusted me with his plans for you. I cannot tell you how proud he would be that you found your way to us now." Tears welled, but Nyla held her voice steady. "I don't know if I can handle all of this. I feel like I've been walking in the dark, and suddenly there's light everywhere. It's too much." Judge Harrison paused before replying. "Your father always said you carried more strength than you realized. He didn't want to give you everything at once. He wanted you to discover your power when you needed it most. That time has come, Nyla, and you're not alone. We'll walk through this together." The reassurance settled over her like a cloak. For months she had felt abandoned, invisible, discarded. Now, for the first time, she felt chosen, protected. After arranging a meeting for the following day, she hung up and sat in the silence. Her eyes drifted to a wedding photo on the wall, her younger self beaming at Adrian, convinced he was her future. She rose, took the frame down, and set it face first on the table. The gesture was small, but it felt like a declaration. This was no longer his story. It was hers. That evening, when Adrian came home, Nyla met him at the door. He looked tired but smug, his tie loosened, his cologne sharp. "Long day," he sighed. "Tomorrow it'll all be official. Finally free. Free." He said it like she had been the cage. Nyla studied him quietly, her face calm though her heart thundered. For the first time in years, she felt no fear of him, only a steady growing resolve. "Tomorrow," she echoed softly, "will change everything." Adrian smirked, not hearing the storm in her voice. He walked past her, whistling, already imagining his victory. Nyla watched him go, her father's words ringing in her mind. "They think they can push you around, Nyla, but they don't know who you are. They don't know whose daughter you are," she whispered into the stillness. "They're about to find out." The courthouse was colder than Nyla remembered. The polished stone floors reflected harsh light, and every sound, the shuffle of papers, the tapping of shoes, echoed louder than it should. She sat at the wooden table, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Across from her, Adrian leaned back in his chair, radiating smug confidence. His lawyer, Preston, whispered in his ear with the kind of smirk that came from years of winning by intimidation. Candace was there too, sitting in the back row in a fire-red dress, her lips painted to match. She smiled as though this was her victory parade, as though Nyla was nothing more than a formality standing in the way of their new life together. The sight burned like acid, but Nyla held still. Her father's words anchored her. "You have roots deeper than you know." Judge Patricia Harrison entered, her black robe flowing, her silver hair tied back. The room hushed instantly. She carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had no time for games. "Good morning," she said, settling behind the bench. "We are here to finalize the divorce proceedings between Adrian Thompson and Nyla Thompson. Mr. Preston, you may present your client's proposal." Preston rose smoothly, shuffling his papers like a magician about to perform a well-rehearsed trick. "Your Honor, my client has been exceedingly generous in his settlement offer. Mrs. Thompson will receive the marital home, though heavily mortgaged, and a monthly alimony of $2,500. Mr. Thompson, of course, will retain his business, his vehicles, and his retirement accounts." Adrian nodded along, glancing toward Candace, who gave him a small, approving smile. To them, the game was already won. When Preston finished, the judge turned her sharp gaze on Nyla. "Mrs. Thompson, do you accept this settlement?" Nyla rose slowly, her knees trembling but her voice steady. "No, Your Honor, I do not." Adrian's head snapped toward her, his smile faltering. This wasn't the script he had written for her. "My client has newly discovered information that materially changes the circumstances of this case," Delilah Patterson announced, standing firmly beside Nyla. Her tone carried the weight of conviction. "Objection!" Preston barked, slamming his hand against the table. "This is a stalling tactic. Mrs. Thompson has had months to disclose whatever—" "Actually," Delilah interrupted smoothly, "this information only became available yesterday due to probate delays involving Mrs. Thompson's late father's estate." The judge raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Proceed." Delilah handed a thick folder to the bailiff, who carried it to the bench. Judge Harrison began to flip through the documents, her expression unreadable. The silence in the room was suffocating. Adrian shifted in his seat, frowning now, whispering urgently to Preston. Candace leaned forward, suddenly less amused. "These documents," Delilah explained, "prove that Mrs. Thompson is not, as opposing counsel has painted her, financially dependent on her husband. Her father, Robert Mitchell, left her a substantial inheritance, one that was never properly processed due to court delays. That inheritance includes commercial real estate, business partnerships, and liquid assets valued at approximately $8 million. The words hit the courtroom like an earthquake. Candace gasped audibly. Adrian's jaw dropped, his face blanching to gray. "That's impossible," Adrian spat, half rising from his chair. "Her father was a janitor." Judge Harrison looked up sharply. "Mr. Thompson, sit down and show respect." From the gallery, a new voice rose, steady, resonant. "Her father was indeed a janitor. He was also one of the most astute investors this city has ever known." Every head turned as Judge Harrison's husband, retired Judge Marcus Harrison, stepped forward with another folder in hand. "Robert Mitchell entrusted me with his estate and with his daughter's future." Adrian's hands gripped the table, his composure cracking. "This is a setup. This isn't enough." Judge Harrison's gavel cracked like thunder. "What we have here is evidence that Mrs. Thompson is not only independently wealthy, but also that Mr. Thompson may have failed to fully disclose his own assets during these proceedings. Mr. Preston, do you have an explanation?" Preston swallowed hard, his earlier smirk gone. "Your Honor, I'll need time to review." "You'll get no time," the judge cut him off. "Not when fraud may be in play." The room fell silent again. Adrian's entire plan was unraveling before his eyes. The power he had wielded so easily for months was slipping, crumbling like sand through his fingers. Nyla sat straighter, her father's words echoing inside her. "Anyone who tries to harm my daughter will discover she has resources beyond what they imagine." For the first time, Adrian's eyes met hers, not with arrogance but with fear. And Nyla thought, "You should be afraid." The courtroom was thick with tension, like the air before a thunderstorm. Adrian shifted in his seat, sweat beginning to form along his hairline. He opened his mouth to protest again, but his lawyer pressed a hand down on his arm, silently begging him to stay quiet. Judge Harrison adjusted her glasses and spoke slowly, each word sharp as a blade. "Mr. Thompson, concealing assets during divorce proceedings is not a minor oversight. It is fraud, and it carries consequences, both civil and criminal." The color drained from Adrian's face. For years he had strutted through life untouchable, the man with the answers, the deals, the wealth. But now, cornered, he looked less like a powerful businessman and more like a child caught stealing. Delilah stepped forward, her voice steady, her words a hammer against the fragile facade Adrian had built. "Your Honor, we have evidence, clear evidence, that Mr. Thompson has hidden significant marital assets through offshore accounts and shell companies. These documents, gathered lawfully, outline transfers, balances, and even communications admitting intent to defraud my client." The bailiff carried another stack of papers to the bench. The judge leafed through them, her face tightening. Preston leaned toward Adrian, whispering furiously, but Adrian's hands were clenched white against the wood, his eyes darting like a man trapped. Nyla sat still, her palms pressed together in her lap. Her heart pounded so loudly she could hear it in her ears, but her face was calm. She thought of every night she had gone hungry so Adrian could save money. She thought of every time. He mocked her dreams, telling her she was nothing without him. And now here he was, exposed, trembling. Finally, the judge spoke. "Mr. Preston, do you dispute these documents?" Preston's voice cracked slightly. "Your Honor, I cannot, without reviewing further, but—" "Then we will proceed, on the assumption that they are accurate unless evidence proves otherwise," the judge cut in. Her gaze locked on Adrian. "Mr. Thompson, you have not only betrayed your wife, but you have betrayed the integrity of this court." Candace shifted in the back row, her face pale beneath her heavy makeup. Her earlier smile had vanished. For the first time, she looked at Adrian not with admiration but with calculation, as though reassessing whether he was worth the risk. Delilah's voice cut through the silence. "We request immediate forfeiture of all concealed assets to Mrs. Thompson as compensation for her husband's deliberate fraud, as well as damages for emotional distress and coverage of legal fees. My client has suffered deeply, not only through his infidelity, but through calculated financial abuse designed to leave her powerless." The words financial abuse echoed like a drumbeat. Nyla swallowed hard, feeling seen in a way she hadn't for years. It wasn't just betrayal, it was abuse. The judge nodded gravely. "Mrs. Patterson, what damages do you propose?" $200,000, Your Honor." Adrian lurched to his feet. $200,000? This is robbery! She doesn't deserve a dime. The judge's gavel cracked down. "Mr. Thompson, one more outburst and you will be held in contempt. Sit down." He collapsed back into his chair, rage and fear wrestling across his face. Nyla finally spoke, her voice soft but clear. 8 years, Adrian. 8 years I stood by you. 8 years I gave up my career, my independence, my dreams. I supported you, entertained your clients, built our home. And you repaid me with lies, with betrayal, with this. She gestured toward the stack of fraudulent documents. Adrian's eyes darted to hers, desperate now. "Nyla, please. We can fix this. We can start over." Her voice cut him off like glass. "No, Adrian. You made your choice the moment you decided I was disposable. The moment you called me a burden. The moment you laughed with her about how easy it would be to leave me with nothing." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Adrian's face twisted, realizing the private conversations he thought were safe had not been so private after all. The judge leaned forward, her voice steady but edged with steel. "Mr. Thompson, you are fortunate this court is treating your actions as civil, not criminal. If you accept the proposed settlement, full forfeiture of concealed assets, $200,000 in damages, and payment of all legal fees, I will finalize this divorce today. If you refuse, I will have no choice but to refer your case for criminal prosecution." The word hung in the air like a death sentence. "Criminal." Adrian slumped, his shoulders caving in as though the weight of his own greed had finally crushed him. Preston whispered frantically, urging him to accept. Candace slipped quietly from the courtroom, leaving him alone. At last, his voice came out small, broken. I accept." Nyla closed her eyes. For the first time in years, she felt the chains break. When the gavel fell, the sound rang through Nyla's bones. It was not just the end of a case. It was the closing of a chapter she had been forced to live in silence. The courtroom emptied slowly. Reporters lingered in the back, whispering as Adrian slumped forward at his table, defeated. His lawyer packed papers in tight, hurried motions, avoiding his client's eyes. Candace was gone. Vanished the moment the word criminal had been spoken. Nyla remained seated, her palms pressed flat against the table, breathing deeply. She wasn't trembling anymore. She wasn't bowing her head. For the first time in years, she felt steady. Delilah placed a hand on her shoulder. "You did it." Nyla shook her head softly. No, he did this to himself. I just stopped letting him hide. They walked out of the courthouse together. Cameras flashed, questions flew, voices tangled in the air. Mrs. Thompson, do you have a comment? Were you aware of your father's fortune? How does it feel to expose financial abuse in court? Nyla kept her chin high, though her voice was quiet. The truth speaks for itself. That night, alone in her apartment, she sank onto the couch. The papers were gone, the fight was over, but the echoes of the past still circled her. Every insult, every restriction, every whispered dismissal. You don't understand. You're impulsive. You're a burden. They clung to her skin like smoke. She closed her eyes and let herself remember. The dress she returned to the store. Tag still hanging because Adrian said it was too expensive. The vacation brochures she hid under the bed. Dreams of oceans and mountains that never came. The time she asked for access to their accounts, only to be told, "Why stress yourself?" "I'll handle it." The sting of his laughter. When she once suggested investing in her friend's business, every memory was another thread in the web he had spun to trap her, and she had stayed. Quiet. Silence had been her shield, but it had also been the weapon he used against her. Now, in the stillness of her apartment, she realized something sharp and painful. Silence had cost her years she would never get back. Her phone buzzed with a new message. It was Delilah. "Tomorrow we'll go over next steps with Judge Harrison's office." "Be ready." Nyla set the phone aside. She wasn't ready for strategy, not yet. Tonight she needed to grieve, not just the marriage, not just the betrayal, but the part of herself she had abandoned for so long. She rose and walked to the mirror. The woman staring back at her was no longer invisible. Her hair loose, her eyes red but clear, her father's watch still gleaming faintly on her wrist. She whispered to the reflection, "You kept quiet because you thought it was safer. But silence is what nearly destroyed you. You won't make that mistake again." The next morning, she met Delilah at a cafe near the courthouse. The place buzzed with chatter, but Nyla sat straighter than usual, her voice firmer when she ordered coffee. Even the small act felt like a reclamation. Delilah spread papers across the table. "We have leverage now. Adrian's reputation will collapse. His company will take a hit. But this isn't just about money. It's about setting a precedent, making sure the court recognized what happened to you wasn't just betrayal. It was abuse. Financial abuse." The words carried weight, even outside the courtroom. Abuse. Nyla let them settle, heavy but clarifying. She had been afraid to name it. Afraid that if she spoke it aloud, it would become too real. But now, spoken plainly, it didn't diminish her. It freed her. Delilah leaned forward. "You know, Nyla, most women in your position don't fight back. They walk away with nothing. They stay silent. But you stood up. Do you realize how powerful that is?" Nyla lowered her eyes to the table. "It doesn't feel powerful, it feels exhausting." "Power usually does," Delilah said with a small smile. Nyla thought of her father again, the words in his letter. Storms don't break strong trees. Maybe exhaustion was part of it. The ache of roots straining deep into the soil, holding fast against the wind. She sipped her coffee, feeling its warmth spread through her chest. For the first time, she wasn't afraid of the day ahead. "What about you? If silence had been your shield, would you keep hiding behind it? Or would you finally lay it down and speak?" That evening, Nyla sat at her kitchen table once more. The boxes of her father's papers were stacked neatly now, no longer chaotic piles of grief, but organized pieces of a plan. Her father's watch ticked steadily on her wrist, each second marking not just time, but survival. She opened her journal, one she had abandoned years ago. Its early pages were filled with bright hopes. Lists of goals, small sketches of places she wanted to travel, notes about books she wanted to write. Then the entries grew sparse, reduced to clipped sentences and unfinished thoughts. Eventually, they stopped altogether as though her voice had been swallowed. Tonight, she picked up her pen. Her hand shook at first, the words hesitant. "Today, the gavel fell, and for the first time in years, I felt free. But freedom feels heavy, too. I have to learn how to carry it." The ink flowed more easily with each line. Her voice, once silenced, began to return on the page. Later, she called her mother, a woman who had moved across the country years before. They hadn't spoken often during Nyla's marriage. Adrian had discouraged it, always finding reasons why long-distance calls were too expensive or too distracting. Her mother's voice was warm when she answered. "Nyla, baby, it's been so long?" Tears stung Nyla's eyes. "I'm sorry, Mom. I should have called sooner." Her mother's tone softened. "Don't apologize. Just tell me, are you safe?" "Yes," Nyla whispered. "I am now." They spoke for an hour. About the court case, about Robert's secret legacy, about Adrian's fall. But mostly they spoke about Nyla, the girl she had been, the woman she was becoming. Her mother reminded her of stories she had forgotten. How as a child she once stood on a chair to recite a poem in church, her small voice filling the room. How she once negotiated with a shopkeeper to lower the price of candy for her and her friends. "You've always had a voice," her mother said gently. "You just forgot how to use it. But I hear it now, and it's stronger than ever." When the call ended, Nyla felt lighter. She hadn't realized how deeply Adrian had cut her off from those who loved her, how much he had benefited from her isolation. But now, with her mother's words fresh in her ears, she felt connected again. The next day, Delilah arranged a press briefing. Nyla was nervous, but she agreed to stand before the cameras. She wore a simple black dress, her hair pulled back, her father's watch on her wrist like a shield. The reporters gathered quickly, microphones flashing, questions firing all at once. "Mrs. Thompson, how does it feel to win against your husband? Did you know about your father's fortune? What will you do next?" Nyla lifted her chin. She didn't flinch. She didn't shrink. Her voice was calm, deliberate. This was never about fortune. This was about truth. "For years I stayed quiet because I thought silence was safety. But silence only gave power to the one who controlled me. Today, I speak not just for myself, but for every woman who has been told her questions are nagging, her dreams are silly, her worth is less than her partner's bank account. I speak for anyone who has been silenced. You are not powerless. You are not invisible. And you deserve justice." The crowd went silent for a moment, the gravity of her words sinking in. Then the questions began again, but Nyla stepped back, signaling she was done. She had said enough. Delilah placed a hand on her back as they walked away. "That," she whispered, "was power." Nyla smiled faintly. "That was me." Back home that night, she opened her journal again. This time, her words flowed strong, filling pages with clarity, not hesitation. She no longer wrote like a woman afraid of being overheard. She wrote like a woman reclaiming her life. Her voice was back. And it would never be silenced again. What about you? If you found your voice after years of silence, what would you use it to say? The courtroom felt different the second time. The air was sharper, as if everyone inside knew that this was no longer just about a divorce. It was about truth, about exposure, about consequences. Nyla walked in wearing a navy blazer, her father's watch gleaming faintly against the cuff of her sleeve. She kept her steps steady, her chin high. She didn't glance at Adrian. Not once. Adrian, by contrast, looked nothing like the man who had swaggered through the first hearings. His suit was wrinkled, his face pale. He muttered furiously to his lawyer, Preston, who seemed to shrink a little more with every passing minute. The gallery was full, journalists, curious onlookers, even a few women Nyla had never seen before who seemed to sit in solidarity. Their eyes locked on her with quiet encouragement. Judge Harrison entered, her gavel striking once. "We are here to continue proceedings on the matter of concealed assets and fraudulent disclosures. Mrs. Patterson, you may proceed." Delilah rose, her presence commanding. She handed the bailiff a folder thick with evidence. "Your Honor, we now have full documentation of Mr. Thompson's hidden accounts. These include transfers to offshore banks, shell corporations registered under false names, and communications between Mr. Thompson and his associate, Ms. Candace Miller, discussing how to hide these funds from Mrs. Thompson." A gasp rippled through the gallery. Candace's name landed like a thunderclap. Adrian stiffened in his seat, his jaw clenching. Delilah continued unwavering. We also have testimony from Mr. Thompson's former accountant, who resigned after refusing to falsify reports. That testimony confirms what the documents already prove: deliberate intent to commit fraud. Judge Harrison's expression darkened. She flipped through the documents carefully, her lips pressed in a tight line. Finally, she looked up. "Mr. Preston, do you contest this evidence?" Preston cleared his throat, sweat beading at his temple. "Your Honor, we ask for time to review." "No," the judge interrupted. "This court has been more than patient. The evidence is overwhelming. We will proceed." Adrian shot to his feet. "This is ridiculous. This is a witch hunt." "She's lying. She's always lied." The judge's gavel cracked like thunder. "Sit down, Mr. Thompson, or I will have you removed." Adrian froze, his eyes darting wildly around the courtroom. He looked at Nyla then, his voice dropping to something almost pleading. "Nyla, please. Don't do this! We can work this out. We don't need them." Her heart clenched at the sound of his voice, familiar, manipulative, the same tone he had used for years whenever she questioned him. But this time, it held no power. She stood slowly, her voice steady though her chest burned. "You had years to work this out, Adrian. Years to treat me with respect. Instead, you hid, you lied, you tried to erase me. No more!" The gallery erupted in murmurs. Adrian's face twisted, caught between rage and desperation. Delilah seized the moment. "Your Honor, this case is no longer about divorce. It is about accountability. My client deserves restitution. But more importantly, this court must send a message. Financial abuse and fraud will not be tolerated." Judge Harrison leaned back, her eyes scanning both sides. The silence stretched long and heavy, every person in the room holding their breath. Finally, she spoke. "Mr. Thompson, you have a choice. Accept full forfeiture of all concealed assets, pay damages of $200,000 to Mrs. Thompson, and cover all legal fees. Or face referral for criminal prosecution." The words landed like a hammer. Adrian's shoulders slumped, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of the table. His mask was gone. The confident smile, the mocking tone, shattered. He looked again at Nyla, but she did not look away this time. Her gaze was clear, unwavering, unshaken. In that moment, the balance shifted. The man who had once silenced her with a sigh, a word, a glare, was now silent himself. If you were sitting in that courtroom watching a man's empire collapse under the weight of his lies, would you feel pity or justice? Adrian's hands shook as he collapsed back into his chair. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that pressed down heavy on every chest. Even the reporters had stopped scribbling, their pens hovering mid-air, waiting. Judge Harrison's gavel rested at her side, her gaze fixed squarely on Adrian. "What is your decision, Mr. Thompson?" He licked his lips, his eyes darting to Preston. His lawyer leaned close, whispering furiously, but Adrian shook his head. He looked lost, cornered, his bravado stripped bare. Finally, he spoke. His voice cracked, raw with defeat. I accept." The words echoed through the chamber, final and irreversible. The judge nodded once. "Let the record reflect that Mr. Thompson has agreed to full forfeiture of concealed assets, damages in the amount of $200,000, and payment of all legal fees. This court hereby finalizes the divorce on these terms." The gavel struck, one sharp crack that marked the end of an empire built on lies. A murmur swept the gallery. Some gasped, others whispered with awe. Adrian sat motionless, his head bowed, his fingers digging into the table as though he could claw his way back to control. But there was nothing left to grip. Candace was gone. His lawyer looked defeated. And the man who had once believed himself untouchable was exposed for what he truly was, a fraud. Nyla rose slowly, her father's watch gleaming faintly in the courtroom light. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She simply stood steady, her silence speaking louder than any words. Adrian's eyes lifted to hers, glassy and desperate. "Nyla, please, don't walk away like this. You know me. You know I can change." Her voice was quiet, but it cut like a blade. "I know you, Adrian. That's why I'm walking away." For the first time in 8 years, she watched his face crumble. Not with anger, but with fear. The fear of a man stripped of power, of the mirror finally showing him the truth. Delilah stepped beside her, her voice calm but firm. "It's done. Let's go." They walked out together, past the flashing cameras, past the murmuring crowd. The sunlight outside felt different, warmer, freer. Nyla inhaled deeply, as though she had been holding her breath for years and could finally breathe again. She paused on the courthouse steps, looking back once more. Adrian stood framed in the doorway, surrounded by reporters, his head low, his shoulders sagging. The mighty man had fallen, and there was no applause left for him. Nyla whispered to herself, "This is what justice looks like." The cameras turned toward her then, questions flying. "Mrs. Thompson, do you feel vindicated? What's next for you? How do you respond to the settlement?" She didn't flinch. She lifted her chin, her voice steady. This wasn't about money. This was about truth, and truth has a way of finding its way into the light. Delilah touched her arm, guiding her down the steps. The crowd parted, and for the first time, Nyla felt the weight of her silence replaced by something stronger, her voice, alive and undeniable. That evening, she returned to her apartment. She sat by the window, the city glowing outside, her father's letter open on the table. She read the words again, tracing each line with her finger. "Storms don't break strong trees, they reveal their roots," she whispered softly. "You were right, Daddy. You were right." Her phone buzzed. Messages from strangers, women she had never met, thanking her for speaking out. Stories poured in. Women trapped in financial abuse, women silenced in their own marriages, women who saw themselves in her struggle. For years she had felt invisible. Now her story was helping others see that they weren't alone. She leaned back in her chair, tears filling her eyes, not of grief, but of release. She was free. If you had stood on those courthouse steps with the world finally listening, what would you have said? The following week, the courthouse buzzed with a different kind of energy. Reporters still lingered outside, but inside, the focus shifted. This hearing was not about dividing assets. It was about exposing the full extent of Adrian's deception. Nyla sat at the plaintiff's table beside Delilah, calm but alert. She wore a simple white blouse, her hair pulled back neatly. The watch on her wrist ticked steadily, a reminder of her father's presence. Adrian entered late, his suit disheveled, his expression hollow. Gone was the confident swagger, the smug grin. He moved like a man carrying chains only he could feel. Judge Harrison called the room to order. "Today we will hear testimony regarding Mr. Thompson's financial disclosures and alleged fraudulent behavior." Delilah stood. "Your Honor, I call our first witness, Thomas Gray, former accountant for Mr. Thompson." A thin man in his 50s walked to the stand, his steps nervous but steady. He raised his right hand, swore the oath, and sat down. Delilah approached. "Mr. Gray, how long did you work for Mr. Thompson?" 6 years, he replied, his voice low. "And during those 6 years, did Mr. Thompson ever ask you to falsify records?" Gray hesitated, glancing toward Adrian. Adrian's eyes narrowed, a silent threat lingering in the glare. Gray swallowed hard. "Yes, more than once." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Nyla's hands tightened in her lap, but her face remained calm. Delilah continued. "Can you explain to the court what he asked you to do?" "He wanted me to create reports that minimized his income, shifted funds into shell accounts, and omitted offshore transfers. When I refused, he pressured me. Said if I didn't, he'd ruin my career. Eventually, I resigned." The words hung heavy. Adrian's face reddened, his fists clenching at the table. Delilah handed a document to the bailiff. "Your Honor, Exhibit A. A letter of resignation from Mr. Gray detailing his refusal to participate in fraudulent activity." Judge Harrison studied the paper before nodding. "Entered into record." Delilah turned back to Gray. "One more question. Why did you decide to come forward now?" Gray's eyes flicked toward Nyla. "Because people like her deserve the truth. And because I'm tired of staying quiet." Nyla blinked back tears. For years, silence had been her cage. Now, even strangers were breaking their own to stand beside her. Preston rose for cross-examination. His tone was sharp, designed to intimidate. Mr. Gray, isn't it true that you left your position because of personal disagreements, not fraud? Gray shook his head firmly. No, I left because I refused to commit a crime. Preston pressed on. And isn't it true you have no direct proof that Mr. Thompson personally moved funds offshore? Gray's voice rose, steady now. He gave me the instructions himself. That's proof enough. The gallery erupted in murmurs. The judge's gavel silenced them, but the impact of Gray's words lingered. Delilah leaned close to Nyla. This is it. The mask is gone. Nyla nodded faintly, her eyes fixed on Adrian. He sat rigid, his jaw tight, his eyes burning with fury. But beneath the rage, she saw something new, fear. Her turn would come soon. She would take the stand. She would tell the truth. And for the first time in years, she was ready. She straightened her back, her father's words echoing inside her. Storms don't break strong trees. They reveal their roots. The storm was here, and she was still standing. If you had been called to the stand to testify against someone who once held your life in their hands, would you have spoken or stayed silent? The courtroom shifted as Delilah announced, Your Honor, we call Nyla Mitchell to the stand. A hush fell over the gallery. Nyla rose slowly, smoothing the fabric of her skirt with trembling hands. Each step toward the witness chair felt like walking through water, heavy, deliberate, impossible to rush. She placed her hand on the Bible, swore the oath, and sat down. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears, but her gaze remained steady. Across the room, Adrian leaned back, arms crossed, a smirk tugging at his lips. He thought he still owned the narrative. Delilah approached gently. Nyla, can you tell the court how your marriage began? Nyla drew a breath, her voice soft but clear. It began with love. Or what I thought was love. Adrian was charming, ambitious. He made me believe we were building something together. He asked me to quit my job, said he'd take care of everything. And I believed him. She paused, eyes flicking to the jury. But over time, his care turned into control. He managed every dollar, every choice, every part of my life until I no longer recognized myself. Delilah's tone was calm but firm. Did Adrian ever make you feel dependent on him? Yes, Nyla said, the word catching in her throat. He told me I was nothing without him, that I had no value outside of his shadow. I wanted to believe I mattered, but he made sure I doubted it every day. Murmurs swept through the gallery. A woman in the back wiped her eyes. Delilah stepped closer. Nyla, can you describe the moment you discovered his affair? The air thickened. Nyla closed her eyes briefly, then opened them with quiet strength. I made him dinner one night. His favorite. I went to his office to surprise him, and instead I found him with Candace. Her voice faltered, but she steadied it with a long breath. I heard him say I was just a situation, that he needed to restructure his assets before divorcing me so I wouldn't get half. That everything we built, everything I gave, meant nothing. Adrian shifted uneasily, his lawyer scribbling notes furiously. Delilah let the silence hang before asking, And how did that discovery affect you? Nyla's voice cracked. It broke me. I felt like my entire life had been a performance I wasn't even cast in. The man I trusted most saw me as disposable. But what hurt the most was how easily he erased 8 years as if I was never there. A single tear slipped down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. Delilah's tone softened. And yet, here you are, strong, speaking the truth. What gave you the strength to come forward? Nyla lifted her chin. My father. Even after death, he gave me hope. He left me proof that I wasn't powerless. He believed in me enough to prepare for the day I'd need it most. He reminded me that I am not the weak woman Adrian tried to shape me into. I am Robert Mitchell's daughter. And I am enough. The courtroom erupted in whispers. The judge tapped her gavel, but even she couldn't hide the flicker of admiration in her eyes. Delilah nodded, stepping back. No further questions. Preston rose for cross-examination, his voice dripping with condescension. Mrs. Mitchell, isn't it true that you benefited from Adrian's success for years? The home, the lifestyle, the comforts? Nyla's eyes sharpened. Comforts? Those comforts came with chains. A gilded cage is still a cage. He stripped away my independence and then mocked me for not flying. The gallery gasped. Preston faltered, flipping pages nervously. You claim emotional abuse, he pressed. But do you have any proof of this supposed mistreatment? Nyla leaned forward, her voice steady. My proof is sitting right there, Adrian himself. His arrogance, his lies, his fraud. You've seen the documents. You've heard his former accountant. His actions prove everything I've said and more. Preston opened his mouth, but Judge Harrison interjected, her tone firm. That will be enough, counselor. The cross-examination ended. Nyla sat taller, no longer trembling. She had spoken her truth, not as a victim, but as a survivor. When she returned to her seat, Delilah whispered, You just changed everything. And Nyla believed it. For the first time in years, she truly believed it. Would you have had the courage to tell the world your deepest wounds, knowing your betrayer sat only feet away? The courtroom was tense, every eye fixed on Judge Harrison as she shuffled the papers before her. The weight of silence pressed against the walls. Everyone could feel that the next word spoken would tip the scales of everything that had been unfolding. Mr. Thompson, she said finally, her voice measured but edged with steel. This court has reviewed substantial evidence suggesting deliberate concealment of assets. Do you understand the gravity of this? Adrian shifted in his chair, his polished confidence cracking under the heat of her gaze. His attorney Preston leaned in, whispering furiously, but Adrian's face was pale. Your Honor, he stammered, this is all a misunderstanding. These accounts, these transactions, they were simply business strategies. Judge Harrison's eyes narrowed. Strategies? Hiding marital assets is not strategy, Mr. Thompson. It is fraud. And in this courtroom, fraud carries consequences. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Adrian tugged at his collar, beads of sweat forming along his temple. Delilah seized the moment. Rising with quiet authority, she addressed the court. Your Honor, these so-called business strategies weren't just numbers on a page. They were weapons. Weapons used to strip a woman of her dignity, to make her believe she was powerless. But Nyla is not powerless. She is standing here today because she chose truth over fear. And truth demands justice. The words landed like blows. Adrian flinched, his jaw tightening. Candace, sitting stiffly in the back row, shifted uncomfortably under the glare of the spectators. Judge Harrison tapped her gavel lightly. Order. She turned back to Adrian. This is your opportunity to come clean. Do you have anything else you wish to disclose before I rule? Adrian's lips parted, then pressed shut again. His silence screamed louder than words. The judge leaned back, her face unreadable. Very well. This court recognizes the will of Robert Mitchell as valid and binding. The inheritance, valued at over $8 million, is to be transferred to his daughter, Nyla Mitchell, effective immediately. Furthermore, given the evidence of concealed assets, this court orders that all undisclosed accounts and properties connected to Adrian Thompson be forfeited to Mrs. Mitchell as restitution. The room erupted. Whispers, gasps, even a few cheers broke through despite the judge's gavel striking 3 sharp times. Adrian shot to his feet, his voice breaking with desperation. You can't do this! That money is mine! Those businesses are mine! Judge Harrison's eyes cut him down. Sit down, Mr. Thompson. Everything you claimed as yours was built on deceit. You thought you could silence your wife. Instead, your arrogance has silenced you. For the first time, Adrian looked small. His broad shoulders slumped. His smirk vanished, replaced by a hollow stare that made him look older, weaker, undone. Delilah turned to Nyla, her voice low but fierce. This is your moment. Stand tall. Nyla rose slowly, her knees trembling but her spine straight. She looked at Adrian, not with pity, not with love, but with clarity. You tried to erase me, she said, her voice carrying across the room. You treated me like an obstacle instead of a partner. But you forgot who I am. I am my father's daughter. I am not your shadow. And today, the world finally sees me. The gallery erupted again, this time with applause, the sound filling every corner of the courtroom. Even the bailiff struggled to maintain order as the emotions spilled over. Adrian collapsed back into his chair, his face gray. Candace slipped quietly out the side door, her red dress vanishing into the hallway like a flame snuffed out. Nyla inhaled deeply, the air tasting different now, lighter, freer. She hadn't just survived. She had won. Judge Harrison struck her gavel once more. This court is adjourned. The echo of that final strike was more than a legal conclusion. It was the sound of chains breaking, of years of silence shattering. As people rose and began filing out, Delilah squeezed Nyla's hand. "Do you feel it?" she whispered. "Yes," Nyla replied, her eyes glistening but steady. "For the first time in years, I feel like I belong to myself." Outside the courthouse, the sun blazed bright against the city skyline. Reporters swarmed, microphones flashing, but Nyla walked past them with quiet dignity. She didn't need to explain herself to the world anymore. The truth had spoken for her. Inside, Adrian sat frozen in his chair, staring at the floor, realizing too late that the empire he thought untouchable had collapsed in a single morning. Would you have the courage to stand in front of the person who tried to destroy you and declare that they failed? The courthouse steps were a battlefield of cameras and questions. Reporters surged forward, microphones thrust into Nyla's face. "How does it feel to win? Do you think Adrian Thompson will face criminal charges? Was your father really worth millions while working as a janitor?" Flashes popped, voices overlapped, the chaos pressing in on all sides. But Nyla kept walking. She didn't run. She didn't hide. Her stride was slow, deliberate, each step a declaration. She was no longer the woman who cowered in her husband's shadow. Delilah shielded her with an arm, guiding her through the crowd. "Ignore them," she whispered. "Your story doesn't belong to the tabloids. It belongs to you." Nyla nodded, her throat tight. She didn't trust herself to speak, not yet. Behind them, Adrian emerged from the courthouse. The press swarmed him instantly, questions sharp as knives. "Mr. Thompson, did you hide assets? What about the offshore accounts? Do you regret betraying your wife?" For once, Adrian had no clever answers. His face was pale, his eyes hollow. He shoved past the reporters, muttering, "No comment," as Candace trailed behind him, her gaze fixed firmly on the pavement. The empire he flaunted so proudly had dissolved into whispers and shame. Nyla paused at the edge of the sidewalk, lifting her eyes to the skyline. The glass towers reflected the morning sun, sharp and brilliant. For years, she had looked at those. Towers as symbols of Adrian's success, structures she had believed she could never touch. But now, she knew the truth. Her father's signature was written in steel beams and concrete across the city. His legacy lived in every building that bore his hidden hand. And that legacy was now hers. Delilah's voice broke her thoughts. "We'll need to strategize next steps. Adrian may appeal, though with the evidence we've secured, he won't get far." Nyla nodded again. "I trust you." She meant it. Trust was not something she gave easily anymore, but Delilah had earned it, brick by brick. As the car pulled up, Nyla slid into the back seat and finally exhaled. The weight she carried was immense, but it was different now, not a chain, not a burden. It was the weight of power, of choice, of freedom reclaimed. For a moment, silence wrapped around her, and in that silence, she heard her father's voice. "You are my greatest investment, Nyla. Not the buildings, not the accounts. You." Her eyes burned with tears, but she let them fall freely. They weren't tears of defeat. They were the release of years of pain, of betrayal, of being told she wasn't enough. The driver asked gently, "Where to, ma'am?" Nyla smiled faintly through her tears. Home. But home was no longer the house Adrian had built with stolen dreams. Home was wherever she could stand without apology, wherever she could live without fear. As the car pulled away from the courthouse, Nyla looked back one last time. Adrian stood on the steps, reporters circling him like vultures. His expensive suit hung limp on his frame. The man who once believed he owned everything now looked like a stranger who owned nothing. Nyla whispered softly, "You tried to erase me, but instead you erased yourself." The city blurred past the window. People rushed along sidewalks, horns blared, life moved on. For them, today was just another day, but for Nyla, it was a rebirth. She pulled out her father's letter from her purse, the edges worn from constant handling. She read the final line once more. "Don't let anyone convince you that you're worth less than everything." Her lips curved into the first genuine smile she'd felt in months. She had been broken, yes, but she was not destroyed. And as the skyline receded behind her, Nyla whispered a promise into the quiet of the car. "This is only the beginning. Would you believe in yourself if the world told you that you were nothing, until one voice reminded you that you were everything?" Weeks passed, but the echoes of the trial lingered in Nyla's life like a haunting melody. Newspapers splashed her story across their front pages. Some framed her as a heroine who toppled a corrupt man. Others painted her as the widow of a hidden empire, suddenly wealthy, suddenly powerful. But none of those headlines told the real story. The real story was quieter, lonelier, and harder to hold. Nyla spent her mornings at her new home, a modest craftsman house tucked into a tree-lined street. No grand chandeliers, no marble staircases, just sunlight filtering through curtains, wooden floors that creaked when she walked, and a garden where wildflowers grew freely. Here she breathed differently. Here she belonged. Still, nights were harder. She would lie awake in bed, listening to the silence, and feel the ghost of Adrian beside her. Not the man she once loved, but the man who laughed behind her back. The man who mocked her tears, the man who made her believe she was small. The memories stabbed at her in the dark, sharp as broken glass. One evening, she sat at the kitchen table with Delilah. Piles of documents lay spread before them. Deeds, partnership agreements, bank statements. "This is yours now," Delilah reminded her gently. "Your father built this for you. Don't let it intimidate you." Nyla stared at the papers. "I don't even know where to begin. Adrian used to handle everything. He made me believe I wasn't capable of more than balancing a grocery list." Delilah reached across the table, squeezing her hand. "He lied to you because he feared what you could become. But Nyla, I've seen you fight. I've seen you win. You are not incapable. You're unstoppable." The words pierced through Nyla's doubts like light breaking through storm clouds. The next morning, she walked into one of her father's buildings for the first time. The lobby bustled with tenants, their conversations echoing off marble floors. She paused by the directory on the wall, her eyes tracing the list of companies. For years, Adrian had boasted about leasing offices in this very tower. He had no idea his wife was the hidden heir to it. Nyla lifted her chin. She wasn't walking through as someone's wife anymore. She was walking through as Robert Mitchell's daughter, as the rightful owner, as the woman no longer afraid to take up space. Later that week, she stood in a boardroom filled with skeptical faces. Men in sharp suits shifted in their chairs, eyes darting toward one another. They had expected Adrian, not Nyla. She placed her father's portfolio on the table. Her voice was calm, deliberate. "I know my father kept his life private. I know many of you didn't realize the extent of his vision. But I am here now. I am ready to honor his legacy. And I am not here to be dismissed." The room fell silent. One man cleared his throat. "With respect, Mrs. Mitchell, experience matters. These are large-scale developments, multi-million-dollar decisions." Nyla met his gaze unflinching. "Experience does matter, and so does integrity. My father built this with honesty and foresight. That's the standard I'll uphold. If any of you doubt me, remember this. I've already beaten a man who thought I was powerless. I will not hesitate to prove myself again." The challenge hung in the air, undeniable. Slowly, the room shifted. Heads nodded. Resistance softened. Respect took root. Walking out of that meeting, Nyla felt something new coursing through her veins. Not just survival, not just victory. It was purpose. Yet purpose didn't erase pain. That night, she sat alone in her living room, her father's letter open in her lap. She traced his handwriting with her fingertips, the ink faded, but the words alive. You are always my greatest investment. Her tears came freely this time, not from weakness, but from release. She whispered into the quiet. I'm trying, Daddy. I hope I make you proud. The firelight flickered across her face, softening the scars of betrayal into something stronger, resilience. Adrian had underestimated her. The world had doubted her. But Nyla was still standing, and she was building something bigger than revenge. She was building a future where her story would not be defined by what was taken from her, but by what she chose to create. Could you rise from the ashes of betrayal and build something so strong that even your enemies are forced to respect it? The seasons shifted. Summer's heat softened into autumn's gold. Nyla's life moved with it, no longer in the shadow of survival, but in the steady rhythm of rebuilding. She spent her mornings in the garden, dirt on her hands, sun on her face. The wildflowers bloomed stronger with each passing week, just as she did. In the evenings, she sat at her desk, working through business ledgers, meeting with advisors, taking calls with tenants who now knew her name not as an afterthought, but as the owner of the empire her father had left behind. Yet even with the victories, grief still visited. Some nights she would wake with Adrian's voice echoing in her ears, belittling, dismissive, sharp. She would sit on the edge of her bed, trembling, clutching her father's watch to remind herself that those words no longer defined her. One evening, she attended a community fundraiser hosted in one of her father's buildings. The hall was filled with music, laughter, and the hum of people gathering for something bigger than themselves. As Nyla stood at the podium, the crowd quieted. She hesitated, the weight of so many eyes on her. Then she spoke. I once believed my life belonged to someone else. I thought I had no voice, no power, no worth outside of being someone's wife. I stayed silent because I thought silence was survival. But silence nearly destroyed me. The room was still. My father lived humbly, but he built something extraordinary. He left me more than buildings, more than wealth. He left me a reminder that storms don't break strong trees. They reveal their roots, and my roots run deep. Applause erupted, warm and thunderous. For the first time, Nyla didn't shrink from the sound. She embraced it. After the speech, women approached her, some young, some older. They told her their stories, of partners who controlled every dollar, of dreams sacrificed, of voices silenced. Each woman carried scars, visible and invisible. But each also carried a spark that Nyla recognized, because she had carried it too. She realized then that her story wasn't just her own. It belonged to anyone who had been told they were less, anyone who had been made small, anyone who had forgotten the sound of their own voice. Later that night, she walked alone through the lobby. The polished floor reflected her steps back at her like a mirror. She paused beneath the tall windows, the city lights sprawling beyond, and felt her father's presence. Daddy, she whispered, I'm still learning, still hurting, but I'm not afraid anymore. And I'm not silent. The quiet pressed in around her, but it was no longer heavy. It was full, alive, carrying echoes of resilience. She lifted her face toward the glass, watching her reflection blur against the lights of the city. She was no longer the woman who bowed her head. She was the woman who stood, who spoke, who built. The legacy was not just her father's anymore. It was hers. And as she walked out into the night, her steps were steady, her spirit unbroken. Would you have the courage to turn your pain into power? And to build a legacy not out of what was taken from you, but out of what you chose to create.